They've invited China to open spy bases. They invite Russia in. They're partners with Iran. They just joined a partnership with South Africa to support Hamas at the expense of Israel. That isn't a government, that is a regime that is hostile to the United States. So there's this process called reciprocity, equal. Whatever you charge us, we get to charge you. Whatever you allow us to do, you're allowed to do. Whatever you block, we're going to block. And I think the president's a big believer in reciprocity, in evenness, in fairness. For some reason, I don't know how this happened, but over the last 20 or 30 years, we felt like it's okay for countries to take advantage of us. And that's just not going to continue under President Trump.
Boom. There you have it, guys. So this is a summary, I think, of how the US actually perceives South Africa right now in the current geopolitics of the world. And if you remember my last video, I actually spoke about how it would be necessary for us to now begin analyzing US foreign policy so that we understand how, you know, the way Donald Trump is going to be going for the next 4 years, how it would affect Africa, but most importantly South Africa, because it appears that South Africa has actually gotten a sort of like a spot, a kind of like a strange spot in the foreign policy of the United States because of what Donald Trump and Marco Rubio here in this video argues that, you know, South Africa seems to have aligned with countries that are hostile to the United States. And so as a result of that, South Africa might be getting some of these, you know, some of the repercussions and tariffs and all of that that's been planned out for many countries that the United States feel are hostile. So it's quite an unfortunate one for South Africa, because I really don't know how just it became that South Africa would then become an enemy, so to speak, to the US. But anyway, Marco Rubio in this video is actually touching on a really lot of interesting things that I think is really important for the South African audience, but also, you know, the American audience and African audience widely, so we understand where America stands with all of these aspects of what he mentions here in this video. So first of all, is about he speaks here in this section on the issue of tariffs to China and the EU. We know that China and the EU are major partners of Africa at the moment. We know that the EU and China have been carrying out a lot of investments in Africa going forward and all that, and how all of those would reap benefits in the coming years. But Marco Rubio here argues that, you know, the US has actually, I think it has actually placed tariffs on the EU. I don't know yet if it has implemented the tariffs on China, but then Canada and Mexico had some pauses, but they are still in the pipeline, all right? And Marco Rubio is actually reminding the world and also Canada and Mexico not to think that Donald Trump is actually bluffing on these things, and that, you know, Donald Trump is a firm believer in reciprocity and fairness. So whatever it is you do, you get that in return, and that's Donald Trump for you. And I think this is how he would likely treat South Africa, you know, going forward, especially as regards South Africa taking Israel to the International Criminal Court of Justice, because Israel and the US actually have proven to be really, really close allies.
Moving on to some of the tariffs now. You're heading up negotiations with Mexico. The president just announced that now. Do these tariffs, especially those against Canada, fundamentally change the relationship that the United States has with our most immediate neighbors?
Well, it changes our economic relationship. The president's point is that trade with Canada is very unfair. You know, that he'll tell you, and he said it repeatedly, U.S. banks can't operate there. There's all kinds of industries that they protect against and do not allow to enter the country. So he views this trade imbalance and says it's unfair and needs to be reset. He also argues they have been less than cooperative on fentanyl and on the inflow of fentanyl. The Canadians will tell you that more fentanyl goes that way than the other way, but increasingly in October of last year, they found a big fentanyl lab inside of Canada, and he doesn't feel like we're getting enough cooperation, and so that's why he's imposed those tariffs. In the case of Mexico, the president's point is much of the northern region of Mexico, sadly, and in direct threat to the Mexican government, is controlled by cartels. And so they've announced they're going to deploy 10,000 National Guard troops, Mexican National Guard troops, to their border, their northern border, and the president's decided to delay tariffs.
This is a new way of doing business, a new world order.
Well, I think the president's point is America's been taken advantage of for far too long, and I think that's true across the board. That's been true on foreign aid. We have countries and places that we pour a bunch of money into, and then they vote against us at the UN every time. They support all of our enemies, and you start asking yourself, why do we keep putting money into this? Our embassies say it, and the USAID says, we don't care, we're going to keep doing it anyways. In other cases, when it comes to trade, there are countries around the world where their companies can do whatever they want in America. They can do anything they want in America, but we can't do it over there. So there's this process called reciprocity, equal. Whatever you charge us, we get to charge you. Whatever you allow us to do, you're allowed to do. Whatever you block, we're going to block. And I think the president's a big believer in reciprocity, in evenness, in fairness. For some reason, I don't know how this happened, but over the last 20 or 30 years, we felt like it's okay for countries to take advantage of us. And that's just not going to continue under President Trump.
So Marco Rubio then goes on to talk about how, Venezuela and the other states in Central South America would have to be taking their criminals back. And one of the reasons why this aspect of this video really interests me is because when he speaks about Venezuela, El Salvador and all that, it just sounds like he's talking about South Africa. The whole thing with protection money and all of that, it happens in the same way in these countries. And for some reason, when Nayib Bukele in El Salvador started chasing these gangs, I think most of them, what he calls the MS-13 groups, I think the set of groups, so to speak, that the US, Donald Trump is trying to hunt now in the US, but also, he also speaks about a Venezuelan, I think it's a group or something, Tren de Aragua. Marco Rubio mentions this in this video, that they are going to be bundled back by Venezuela and El Salvador, and these leaders have to take back these criminals because they are criminals in from their country who got into the US, started committing crimes, and made made the US a place that is not safe, according to Marco Rubio here. But one thing that I actually also find interesting is that if their countries, for example, do not want back these criminals, all right, what then happens? Because right now, South Africa has not yet stood up to the presence of all the gangs. I remember one, Gayton McKenzie actually argued that almost all the headquarters of all the gangs, probably in Africa or maybe even in the world, are in South Africa. And so if these countries are unwilling to take back these gang members who are from their countries, I really hope that we might not be seeing a South Africa flooded with more gangs amidst the 82 murders a day we already hear in South Africa, and also all the whole pressure in South Africa going forward. So I really hope that, but this is what he actually has to say about that.
As part of all of this, the president again said that Canada should be our cherished 51st state. Is he serious, and are you working on that at the State Department? Well,
we're not involved in a negotiation to make them a state. And obviously, I think what we're focused on right now is what's most immediate in front of us, and that is that there's tariffs. That's obviously going to have an impact on our relations with them. We're still neighbors. We'll always be neighbors. Canada will always be our neighbor. Mexico will always be our neighbor. We can't move. You can't move to another neighborhood, right? Mm-hmm. So we're going to have to live alongside each other. And I hope we can find agreements. Again, we're the Department of State. We're the diplomats. So we're looking for ways to find things that are amicable. But I do think that neither Canada nor Mexico should make the mistake of thinking that this is bluster or that the president is just talking for purposes of negotiating leverage. He is serious that the U.S. is not going to be taken advantage of. And it's not just limited to Canada or Mexico. He's talked about some of the unfairness in the EU. He's imposed additional tariffs. We already had tariffs on China. These are additional tariffs.
And can China expect more, do you think, on top of what he's already proposed?
Well, if they continue to cheat and steal, yeah, absolutely. Look, China's acting in their national interest. I don't like it, but I don't blame what the Chinese leaders are doing. They're doing what any leader of a country would do. If you let them take advantage of you, they will. So I think he wants to bring fairness back to that relationship. And obviously China's going to be upset that we try to bring fairness because they've had a really good deal, an unfair deal for a long time. The president is going to make that equal. And look, that's going to create outrage in Washington and in editorial boardrooms. But millions of people, whether they're watching this broadcast or just living in real world America, say, of course, this all makes sense. All of it makes sense to them.
Bringing it back to our region right now, Venezuela is taking back migrants that the Trump administration is deporting. They've released American prisoners. Maduro doesn't seem like the type of person to be doing things just out of the goodness of his heart to help the United States. Is this administration going to recognize Maduro as the legitimate leader of Venezuela?
There's no talks about doing that. No one's discussed it. We don't recognize him now. What he's agreed to is very simple. He's released Americans that should never have been in his prisons. They were hostages. They're not prisoners. They were hostages. He takes them for trade. And he's going to accept, especially these Tren de Aragua criminals. We'll see if he actually does it. I hope they do. We got to get these people out of our country. They came from Venezuela, came through a bunch of other countries, wound up here, committing crimes in the United States. He pushed those people out of his country. He emptied out his jails and prisons and pushed them into other countries and towards the United States, and he's going to have to take them back. I think leaders like Maduro, no matter how tough they try to be, they respect Donald Trump. They know this is not a guy who's going to send you a strongly worded letter. He will take actions. I'm not going to talk about what those actions are, but he knows and they know we have many options to inflict serious damage and harm on the Maduro regime if they don't do what international law requires them to do, and that is accept their foreign nationals who are illegally in this country, especially those who are criminals. That's the priority, the criminals.
And that's a lot of part of your conversations down here in Central America as well, getting people to take, governments to take their nationals back. But will they also take back people from other countries that we can't deport directly to?
Well, I think we'll leave here today with two things. First of all, President Bukele here in El Salvador has always taken back their nationals. It's been a very strong partner of the United States. The Biden administration treated him very poorly. Probably the most popular leader in Central America, maybe all of Latin America in terms of public approval ratings. And because he made this country safe. He really did, and very popular. So he's always been willing to take back his nationals, has taken them back. He'll continue to do so. And I think he'll agree to take back these MS-13 killers. He's built this prison system here to house them. And I think he's willing to take back these Tren de Aragua criminals that are not El Salvadorians, but he's willing to house them in these prisons that he's built as well, because he's an ally of the United States.
And we'll see that in other countries as well, do you think?
Well, every country has a different level of capacity. But he has become sort of an expert in the region at dealing with crime and gangs in the street. Look, El Salvador is a country where 5 years ago, 6 years ago, you couldn't go out at night. You couldn't be out after half dark. There were people here, I used to, when I last here 2 years ago, you would talk to vendors, street vendors. They would tell you that every week some kid would come by on a bicycle and collect protection money from the gangs. If you didn't pay them the protection money, they'd cut off your daughter's ear, they'd cut off your son's hand, they'd kidnap them. That's gone. All that extortion is gone. He basically wiped up all these gangs and put them in these prisons, and they're gone. Yeah. This is now a safe country. He's a leader in that. You see what it's done in El Salvador. I hope other leaders will follow his example. But he now has the capacity to help house some of these people because he's a partner and an ally of Donald Trump. Joe Biden treated him very poorly.
Now, here he actually speaks about Iran, and he actually explains how the U.S. perceives Iran as being in trouble because the Iranian people are really tired of the Iranian regime. The Iranian regime haven't really stood up to, what they promised would be the test of time, in their support to what he calls terror organizations in the Middle East, the Hezbollah, the Hamasis, the Houthis of Yemen. He actually argues that Iran has been funding these guys and, has been proven to be hostile to the United States. And also, if we believe Rob Hersov in South Africa, who actually argues that Iran also has funded South Africa at some point, one point or the other, through MTN, which is a telecommunication network, then you could understand how the U.S. perceives South Africa in the wider frame of things. And I really don't know. I think that's not so good for South Africa going forward. But anyway, that's it. I'll listen to what he says about this.
Very quickly on Iran, do you expect that the pressure campaign, the maximum pressure campaign, is coming back against Iran?
I think Iran right now is in very serious trouble because the people of Iran hate them. The people of Iran hate their own leaders. They hate them. They've destroyed their country. They've given all this money to Hezbollah. They've given all this money to terrorist groups, and they've done nothing for their own people. So they've got a lot of problems internally. I think they've lost. Hezbollah's been weakened. Hamas has been weakened. They've lost Syria. They got kicked out of Syria. So they're very, very vulnerable.
So time to apply more pressure?
I think we need to apply more pressure to Iran until they stop doing the activities that they're doing. What are those activities? They're trying to ultimately get to a nuclear weapon. They keep providing weaponry for all these terrorist groups, the Houthis, okay? This group in Yemen that basically attacked global shipping and raised prices for everybody. All of their weapons were given to them by Iran. All of their weapons were given to them by Iran. So until the Iranian regime stops promoting international terrorism the way they have through Hezbollah, Hamas, the groups they have had in Syria, the groups they have in Iraq, I think they need to face more pressure, not just from us, but from other countries in the world that are implicated or feel the wrath and feel the punishment of what they've done.
Cracking down on oil sanctions, tightening those up, even more sanctions you think are needed?
Absolutely. And we'll see. I mean, the president hasn't made a pronouncement on that yet. He's making a decision on what exactly that is. The bottom line is the president's goal is to get Iran to stop supporting terrorism and stop destabilizing the region and stop trying to be the dominant force in the Middle East. That has to end. They're a direct threat to Israel, but they're really a direct threat to the United States. That threat needs to go away. The president is going to reestablish deterrence. He has many options at his disposal to do that, and those will be forthcoming soon.
About this. Then also now, finally, he actually speaks about the competition with China. He's actually arguing that he doesn't, kind of like resist the fact or deny the fact that China is a prosperous country. China would always, be a wealthy country. They have all the capacity it takes, but that the U.S. will not become a country that will be dependent on China for tech, for medicine, for all of that. I remember in this channel, I usually speak about, China presenting sort of like a vehicle for the labor force of the world. All right, so it's actually called the Great Doubling. It's a concept by, I think, an American academic, or I don't remember, but it's actually the concept of a great doubling, where China then becomes that source of labor, where and from China going forward, and every other source of labor in all these other countries, especially in Africa, become redundant because there's a larger supply of labor from China. And he actually also argues that China is always in charge. China is always after its own interests, all right? So there's been a lot of arguments in South Africa that if the U.S. pulls funding and its aid from South Africa, China would actually probably fill in those gaps, or BRICS countries. But he's actually arguing here, Marco Rubio, that China is a country that actually stands for its own interests. And so that's really a tricky one to really place hope and, all faith in Chinese replacement of U.S. aid by South Africans who actually are angry that Donald Trump sounds like he's insulting South Africa and actually saying South Africa or the US to go to hell. So this is actually what he's actually thinking, and also the fact that he's not happy with Cuba, and that Cuba's alliance with South Africa going forward makes South Africa, so to speak, a hostile country to the US. Really, really powerful point. So just quickly listen to him break down this understanding on this is how the US and especially Donald Trump seems to see South Africa going forward. And for the next 4 years, if there aren't really ratifications or negotiations on how this relationship would be, then I think probably South Africa would have to brace up and really be strong for probably what's Donald Trump might wake up to implement as tariffs or sanctions on South Africa. So listen to Marco Rubio and share your thoughts in the comments.
And arguably the most complex relationship you're going to have to manage is that with China. Are you planning on going to Beijing anytime soon?
We have no plans to go at this time, but you're right. I mean, look, the future of the 21st century will be about the relationship between the United States and China. China's going to be a rich and powerful country. They already are. We're not going to keep them from being a rich and powerful country. What we cannot allow is to live in a world where China dominates an entire continent and nobody there can have deals with us. What we cannot have is to live in a world where we depend on China for things we need to be strong. We can't depend on them for industry. We can't depend on them for critical minerals. We can't depend on them for energy. We can't depend on them for medicine. We can't allow them to take over the car industry, the telecommunication industry. That can't happen. We can't reach a point in the world where the United States depends on China. We can never allow that to happen. It's not about containing them. It's about reestablishing real balance. They're a great power. They're going to be a great power. It's a big country. It's historically been a great power. But there needs to be fairness and equality and that balance in that relationship. And it cannot lead to an America that's dependent on China for everything that makes us safe and strong and prosperous.
The final question, and I think it's a very good place to end, sir. Do you see yourself as the representative of the United States government ever going to Havana?
Well, first of all, I have no intention of going to Havana with this regime in place other than to discuss when they're going to leave. That regime is a disaster. It's destroyed the country. It's turning Cuba into a nursing home, sadly. The only people that don't leave are the ones that are too old or too sick to leave. They've lost 10, 12% of their population just in the last 3 years. They're incompetent and they're evil, that regime. But they're also a threat to the United States. They've invited China to open spy bases. They invite Russia in. They're partners with Iran. They just joined a partnership with South Africa to support Hamas at the expense of Israel. That isn't a government, that is a regime that is hostile to the United States. And so until that changes, there's nothing for me to talk about with them.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for your time.
Thank you.